Online Summit. I'm Kosha Joubert, and I am one of the 4 hosts of this event. And lucky as I am, today I'm here for the next interview, and we're going to be talking today to Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams, who is an author, spiritual teacher, and founder of the Center for Transformative Change. Ordained as a Zen priest, Reverend Angel is a sensei, the second Black woman recognized as a teacher in the Japanese Zen lineage. She's a visionary who applies wisdom teachings and embodied practice to social issues at the intersections where race, climate, and economic justice meet. She coined the name for the field of transformative social change and sees it as America's next great movement. In recognition of her work, Reverend Angel received the first Creating Enlightened Society Award from the International Shambhala community. She has been bridging the worlds of personal transformation and justice since the publication, and of course before, but especially since the publication of her critically acclaimed book, Being Black, Zen, and the Art of Living with Fearlessness and Grace. Her new co-authored book, Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation, is a powerful wake-up journey that is igniting communities, activists, Buddhists, and beyond to have the conversations necessary to become more awake to what hinders liberation of self and society. Reverend Angel, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to start off our conversation with a question that we ask to all the speakers. And we'd love to hear your response to this one. Why do you think it's important for people to understand personal and collective trauma in the world today?
That's a very good question, and it feels like the question that I'm navigating all the time these days. I think that very much, certainly here in the States, and I think in the West at large, we have developed ourselves in this very strong sense of individuality. We came through an era. In maybe something like 30 years ago, where there's an increasing amount of focus on personal trauma, how people have been affected by the ways they were raised in their families, what kind of impact that has. We have a lot more information in terms of the sciences and understanding how generational wounding occurs, and how the ways that you've been brought up in your family and the ways that your surrounding environment impacts you, and the experiences of traumatic experiences, whether those are large traumas or smaller individual sustained traumas, that how they can affect how you develop as a human being. I think that owing to that strong emphasis on individuality that has been very much a part of the sense of innovation and possibility and reinventing and of ourselves, that has been a strong aspect of what makes the West powerfully different, and I think in many ways it's very much a part of what we think of as our modernity, right? That's what makes us modern, is that we can reinvent. We're not bound so much by class or station or where we were born in the way that it had been for hundreds of years. We're not bound by the expectations so much of our entire tribe, certainly still our families and things, but we are an individually oriented society. And as a result of that, one of the things I think that we have left behind is an understanding that we as individuals are part of collectives. We're all part of collectives, and we hold, as a result of that, not just the experiences of ourselves as individuals, but we also hold the experiences, the relationality and the impacts of what happens to our collective body as well as what happens to our individual body. So collective trauma is a way for us to get an understanding and get a window into what things that we ourselves don't recognize as having had an individual experience, and yet we're still acting out of the ways that out of something that doesn't seem like, well, this didn't happen to me, but it's happened to us as a collective. And so I think it holding and understanding both of those things gives us a fuller picture of ourselves. And it re-invites us into the wholeness of being a part of collectives, whether it's collective small group or collective, the one large collective, which I think is actually necessary for our healing and our sense of relationship in the world.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll continue with a very basic question. Someone had touched me. I think it's a sentence that actually came from your TEDx talk, where you spoke about, and I'd love to hear your response to this. What would change if the movements we are part of, or also the collectives we are part of, were grounded in stillness?
Yeah, we again are part of, and I think that speaks very much to collective and the way that movements for change, movements that have been organized around the idea that we need to advocate on behalf of people that have less in society, have less access, have less resources, and that kind of thing. But simultaneously, those movements have developed inside of the collective body of the social culture of, certainly in the United States and in the West. And as a result, we carry those collective behaviors. And one of those collective behaviors that are very much a part of our society is this impulse to kind of keep doing and doing and doing. And we keep going and we keep moving. And movements are wonderful, and they're about movement. But there is also something that's really important and powerful for our overall sense of personal development, is to understand our own beings and our own bodies, our own needs, our sense of limits, what is possible for us on any given day, and certainly in our own sense of capacity and what's available to us. In order to do that, we have to have the contrast of being able to slow down and come to a place of stillness that manages that dynamic relationship between what it is to be a human doing and what it is to be a human being. I think it's very difficult to understand how to be a human being if we don't have a period of time and regularly that is sustained and revisited frequently, in which stillness and listening and noticing is part of the way in which we take up information, rather than all of the ways that are about just, consuming more and more and taking more in, keeping moving.
Yeah, beautiful. And I guess it's also in those moments that we can even really deeply start to see where individual trauma and collective trauma are shaping our doing. It's more in the stillness, right, that we can really gain that perspective. And maybe that leads over to the next question, because I loved how you spoke about love. And missing of a shared understanding is creating confusion amongst us.
Yeah, I think we have some idea about love, but it's relegated to a pretty narrow set of streams. So we have a sense of romantic love. I mean, it's a little off in that regard too, but we have a sense of romantic love and filial love, the love between our parents, and the love across a sense of desire and romanticism. We don't so much have a shared understanding or a teaching or an opportunity to be steeped into what it means to hold ourselves in the broader sense of love that is across lines of difference. It is beyond a sense of what you like right? That there's a love that has nothing to do with what you like. And there is a love that is about understanding our location in that larger collective, our relationality to all that is, and being able to cultivate a capacity and an ability to hold ourselves in relationship to all that is, whether that's someone that is very different from us, or whether that is, it's like a set of people that have very different ideas and beliefs, and what it means to be able to recognize that we are part of that whole is that we have cultivated, we cultivate and we engage in a relationship that situates love at the center of how we relate to people, place, and the planet, and I think that because we don't have that shared sense, and we have hyper individualized love as something that is possessive and is about solely about like my choice and what I like, we've corrupted the most powerful aspect of it, which is that it transcends our sense of it transcends our sense of choice. It pushes us outside of the boundaries of the things that are already known to us, and it invites us into a truly awesome place that has a great deal more room than our ordinary everyday minds would allow for.
So it sounds like you're saying that love happens especially in those places where normally we would experience disconnect. Like,
yeah. I think that love gives us, I've spoken about love being space, and love provides for a kind of spaciousness when we cultivate it. It's both something that we cultivate and also arises, and so we cultivate the skill set and develop the capacity within ourselves for love, which has very much to do with how we hold ourselves in love. What arises out of that is a greater amount of spaciousness so that we can allow others to be as they are, and that doesn't break our sense of connection to them. It doesn't break our sense of connection to the world. The disappointments and failed expectations do not become a place that relegates us to being isolated and so differentiated that we're no longer a part of and have a sense of belonging to the whole, whether the whole is the whole of you and I in this space together right now, or whether the whole is the greater whole of my relationship to the planet and as a being.
Yeah, beautiful. And just, to bring even more precision to that, it's amazing with how much precision you also speak about these things. Like in your talks, you invite us to disrupt the disconnect that lives inside of us. And I brought a quote from you that I just love, where you say, "Now, no matter how much you want to believe in the power of love, as long as that disconnect lives inside of you, you will uphold structures of disconnect out there."
Yes.
So can you just, how do we do that? How do we uphold structures of disconnect out there when we have the disconnect in here?
Yeah. So I think it's first important to understand that many systems of domination thrive and are built around disconnecting ourselves from our natural impulse to care and connect and have a sense of compassion. That is what they're built on. It's what they thrive on. It's what they rely on. So they rely on us having a sense of disconnect, not only from others, but also from ourselves, in order for us to abdicate responsibility and accountability for ourselves and for our sense of relationship to people and planet. And so systems of domination are quite strongly oriented towards cultivating a sense of disconnect. It does that not by saying, hey, you're disconnected, by saying you're only connected to this. The only way you understand yourself as whole and true is if you are focused on this particular set of people and you're only with those kinds of people. If you only believe these things, and religion has been a fomenter of that kind of disconnect in many ways. Largely, I'm sure, unintentional, but also it serves those larger institutional structures that seek to control the ways in which people flow. I don't think it's sort of like we're after trying to create disconnect amongst people, but that's how we get control, is we make sure that people are focusing their attention on, here's where the rules come from, here are the protocols, here's what you do, and here's what you don't do. And in order to get you to abdicate your own sense of self-agency so that you can listen to the rules, right? I have to cultivate a sense of, like, this is the only way you're going to know who you are. This is how you actually know that you're alive. And so that happens from large institutions. It also happens in family systems, with parents that inadvertently or out of their own unwellness create that sense of, I am the one that decides how things go. And so that creates a disconnect from our core and deeply inherent sense of dignity, a sense of knowing, a sense of being able to feel into in our bodies what is right and what is true and what is what connects us. And so when those systems come about that create that disconnect and cultivate that disconnect in us, we're disconnected from our organic knowing, and we live a life of fundamental confusion. And so we can then have cognitive belief in the idea of love, but our embodied sense of a firm clarity of what is right and what is true is muddled and confused and broken and disconnected.
Yeah. And it feels like, that there's this deep invitation to come home to ourselves, to deeply reconnect ourselves so that we can reconnect to each other in everything you say and do. Mm-hmm. And, one question that has been with me again and again through my life, and I want to bring it to you also. And again, I want to start with a quote from you where you say, you have a right and a responsibility to liberate yourself from anything that is obstructing your heart.
Yes.
Our own suffering has been carried to a degree that it hinders our full humanity.
Yeah.
And, sometimes it seems to me as if those that have suffered most and that have been most traumatized also are asked or need to do most of the work in order to heal. And, that's how it is, right? But it also sometimes feels unfair. So I just want to bring this question to you. How do you see the role of perpetrators in this, or of those also of us who come from a lineage of perpetrators and are still living in privilege today? I think that possibly many of us listening to this particular online summit will also come from those lineages, So how do you see that work?
I think that the relationship that we have to dominance and, historic trauma, that has a historic collective trauma of some peoples and their lineage, and having visited trauma upon other peoples, certainly not the least of that is not, the least of that is not certainly the kind of violence and harm and aggression that has been visited upon indigenous peoples all over the world who have been forced out of their lands and homes and the places that they originate from, enslaved peoples from the African diaspora, from the from the Jewish diaspora, all kinds of peoples. And so we've seen this over and over again played out. I think that one of the things that we have so deeply gotten upside down in the way that we revisit these stories and recount these stories when we're wanting to work through healing is that we very much focus our attention solely on we strongly focus our attention on the material aspect of harm. And as a result of that, we leave the perpetrators out in terms of what wounding has happened to the perpetrators. And I tend to think that wounding is much more subtle and deep and held in the collective body in a way that doesn't allow us to get to it, because it continues in some ways to reify and center power with the so-called perpetrators when we don't allow for, right? It recenters power over when we don't allow for the fact that the so-called perpetrators not only are wounded by their actions, but must have been wounded in order to commit these kinds of violences and atrocities against humanity. And the violence and atrocity against humanity is first and foremost against their own humanity, is an indicative of the wounding and brokenness and disconnect inside their own humanity. And we recognize this on an individual level. We recognize this on an individual level. We see someone commit some kind of harm. They go and they shoot up a school, or they open fire in a mosque or a temple. They do, and we go, what happened to them? What was the history, right? Because we recognize this is out of balance. It's out of a state of fundamental reality of the nature of human beings. So we recognize something's wrong. We don't apply this to the collective and say something must have been wrong, deeply wounded and broken in those peoples in order to engage in that kind of human behavior, right? Antisocial behavior. I think it is a really significant problem that we don't label sociopathy on a collective level, and we only relegate it to an individual level. It is very much, for me, the conversation about realizing the relationship between individual trauma and collective trauma. There is collective sociopathological behaviors. And because we don't recognize them and name them as that, we simply end up with this, like, there's the perpetrator and there are the victims. And it doesn't give space for the people that have been the actual perpetrators, but also in the lineage of perpetrators, a window into navigating and noticing and looking for the exploration and interrogating the collective trauma that had to sit at the root of that. And if you don't believe that's true, or that doesn't quite make sense to you, then what you're saying is that there are maybe some humans as a whole, peoples, that are just fundamentally evil and do harmful things. I don't believe that. I think that we are fundamentally have fundamental goodness, and we want to be in care and connection and compassion with each other. And so when we're not doing that, something has hindered our heart, right? And it's hindered our individual heart. And when we abdicate our agency to participating it amongst a collective, we have hindered the collective heart, and wounding and trauma is not only the result of that, it must be the seed and the driver of that.
Yes, that's strong. I think this is it's an important message somehow to land deeply, and it feels like at this time that as you started off, also just the importance of really acknowledging these energies as they move through us as collectives. And I wonder, how do you see the world today? How do you see humanity? Do you feel that there is more willingness to acknowledge these streams and really step towards the healing of individual and collective trauma? Are you watching a shift happen around that?
Yeah, I think I'm watching both shifts happen, and that's the dynamic tension. I think there's some, certainly, and what we tend to talk about in the news and the media is the division and the doubling down on what I would say is a more historically known paradigm, right? And the historically known paradigm is the paradigm of, like me, tribal. I'm defined by a sense of sameness, right? Which very much comes out of, or I want to say is reinforced by institutional and governmental and so on impulses towards control and domination and control over, power over. So we're seeing a doubling down of that as people that are situated in places see the places that they are accustomed to being in change. Simultaneously, we are seeing the way that we make meaning, which is work. And I always say that human beings, the way we make meaning of like our existence is that we work, right? We do stuff, we produce things, we create things, like all of the inflections of work. And so I think as far as I can tell, for all of written history, once we got into social organization, we were defined by these very two important things: our place, which meant our physical place as well as our place amongst our society, and also work, like what we did, our place and what we do. And that is significantly disrupted at a level that is extraordinary in our understanding of written history. So that for the first time, you have a critical mass of people, and they're spread all over the world, but they're certainly concentrated in Western society, where we are movable people and we're malleable. We pick up and we move to other places. So we're no longer so defined by our place, not only in our physical location in the land that we come from, but even amongst our family, right? And amongst the tribe and amongst the peoples that we grew up amongst. We pick up and we go someplace else and we reinvent and become someone different. Similarly, we pick up and reinvent ourselves in work. We don't have like one work that we do. And I think that because of that, you have this juxtaposition between, I would say, these movable, malleable people that are understanding and knowing themselves more fully by difference rather than by sameness. And you have the historically conventional and known paradigm in which the way that we organized ourselves and knew who we were had to do with sameness. And so as we see more different people come into the spaces and places of our historic sameness, we are severely disrupted if we're part of that conventional space. And at the same time, these people that are moving and malleable are like actually moving at a pace, I would say, that is difficult for the people that are still orienting themselves towards, like, wait a minute, I knew how I am because I grew up in this place and we dug up coal, and now you all are saying that it's not good for the earth. But what does that mean about the work I do and the people that I live with, and my grandfather's grandfather who also, cut off mountaintops to dig up coal, and, whatever it is that we're doing, right? And so we have this great big clash. And that moving and malleable group of people, to your original question, I think is incredibly not only willing but no longer able to abide by the not exploring their collective and individual trauma. They just can't abide by it anymore. They literally can't survive it because the veil has come off. It's been pulled back, and I like to say the remembering that is very much a part of many of these movements that are about stillness, that are about exploration, that are about inner work, that are about looking inward. When we look inward, we start to remember, right? We come back together into a wholeness. And once you get a sense of like that there's a wholeness there, that you've been missing all your life or lifetimes or generations. You can't turn that back again. And so we have both the beauty of that and I think the hopefulness of that, but we're in the dynamic tension of the peoples that don't have those tools or orientations that feel incredibly disrupted by the perpetual grasping and moving towards, more and more difference.
Yeah, so this increasing movement and difference, which of course is also hugely enhanced by the internet, a whole another level of movement, right? And so there's that constant opening also happening in us, right? As we keep meeting ourselves and each other more intimately. It's what I hear you say. And I wonder, as you speak about these movements, that a practice to root themselves in stillness and be with what comes to them, as we move through the world in this way. How would you describe the practice that is needed as trauma shows up in ourselves or between us as we meet trauma in the world? What is your practice, or how do you advise we practice?
Yeah, I think the most powerful practice that we have is to be with the feeling that arises in our bodies as a result of coming into contact with the disconnect that trauma has created in us. Much of our societies have been organized around keeping us moving, so that when we experience the discomfort, that it's just papered over and we go back to business as usual, because that's what's needed for us to continue to produce. That's what's needed for us to continue to follow the rules. That's what's needed for us to not peel the curtain back and say, who is back there, running this show. And so we have an enormous amount of distraction culture that has been crafted and cultivated in order to keep us from being able to abide by, to tolerate the discomfort of our own disconnect. And so I think that the most powerful practice that we can engage with is first of all, is to get in our bodies so that we can actually feel that disconnect. Right? The disconnect is not just a cognitive disconnect, it's an embodied discognition, right? It's like that, the embodied cognition, the ways that our body knows what is true and right and real and what is off, that is far more intuitive, faster, more real in many ways than the mental fabrications that we've papered on top of it, right? And we know that's true because we paper beliefs on top of it and go, that's not really happening. It's really happening in our body, but beliefs can make it go away as if it's not actually happening. So the first practice is to actually get in our bodies, to recognize that systems of domination, that structures of oppression, that collective wounding is visited upon us most powerfully by disconnecting us from our own knowing, our own inner knowing. And our inner knowing is not just a knowing that happens up here. Inner knowing is an inner knowing that is that relationality between the gut, I would say, right, our core, the gut, the heart, and the head. And that the heart, I think of is a receiver. And so we might feel something in our heart, but it doesn't motivate us to always necessarily do something about it. So we can feel something's off. So it's connecting to our bodies and our core and our gut that inspires us to do something, right? Because that's where movement comes from and action comes from, to actually do something about it. And paradoxically, it turns out the thing that we most often need to do is to actually sit with it and to be with the discomfort and to move ourselves through the teaching, the deep teaching that has existed from the beginning of time, since humans beings just sat down and be still, that we can survive the discomfort. And that when we survive the discomfort and we move through the discomfort, we are made more whole as a result.
Hmm. Yeah, it's like the strongest activism starts in stillness. Like, yeah, and I love that you call out this false divide between personal and social awakening. You know, that exactly what you're speaking about right now. So, yeah, how do you balance this in your own life? Or, you know, what can you say about this attending both the inner work of healing our personal and intergenerational trauma, as well as the outer work of standing up as activists in the world against injustice or, you know, the climate emergency? How do you marry this?
You know, the way that I speak about this is that I understand myself as a product of my social development, like the spaces, right, that I inhabit and what I've been born into. Both the ones that feel like, oh, I'm into those, and that's great. You know, I'm really happy to be the race and background and cultural orientation I am, but also I inhabit and have inherited from the larger social system of things that have advanced these oppressions, that have advanced these I want to say really ill relationship to the body of our planet and us as beings that arise out of this planet. So I know that I have these things in me, just as even if I simultaneously have ideas about bringing an end to those things. My idea that I want to stop a kind of violent behavior doesn't take away the fact that I've been deeply steeped in a culture that is violent and aggressive. And so the way that I tend to balance is, okay, I have this idea that I want to shift this, but if I really want to shift it, then I want to shift it in ways that's not recreating it, because I have this imagination that I'm not the first person that got the idea that I want to advocate on behalf of people that are ill-treated on our society or on behalf of our planet. And so, since I'm not the first person, something must happen that gets us caught up so that the systems keep recreating themselves and getting more subtle and more crafty.
Right.
So I want to ask myself, what is it in me? How is it that I have been armed by these systems as carriers and weapons, if you will, of those same forms and ways of being aggressive, of having a sense of disconnect that keep the systems going. So first I think about disarming myself and doing a deep interrogation with myself of noticing all the places, not just in the narrow field of when I'm doing activism or advocacy, but in the field of my entire life. When am I recreating a sense of domination? When am I having the impulse to dominate, to grasp after power over? When am I attaching myself to feeding disconnect? When am I participating in all kinds of ways, subtle and coarse, in the same underlying energetics that keep these systems going? And if I'm not willing to do that work and do that interrogation, I am bound to continue to perpetuate the same cycles of behaviors that give rise to violence and aggression and domination and power over and disconnect with people and beings and species and planet. And so I want to do that, but I also want to recognize that the world keeps moving, and it's a lot of work. I've got a lot of habits like stored up in this being and these number of years I've been on the planet. So I also have to get out there and roll my sleeves up and do some work in the meantime, and be in that dance between the inner and the outer, a kind of cultivating and really compassion for myself, and in the recognition of I am a product of this very same system. I'm not against the system. I am of this system, and I have to be kind to the fact that I am going to find myself stepping in it and recreating aspects of the system. But if I'm committed to do the work and say, oh, there it is, there's that thing, I'm doing that thing. And I'm not doing it as like a Black person against a white person. I'm doing it as this mixed race person with my child or with my partner or with my lover or my teacher or my friends or my colleagues or my boss or whatever, right? This narrowing, if that somehow, the messiness of how we've inherited trauma and enact that trauma is only limited to the field of the places that we want to look at is exactly the reason I wrote and talk about radical Dharma, that we have to have a whole truth, a whole and complete truth. And there's no such thing as a complete truth because things are always changing. And so it's dynamic. And that's my practice, is to be in this radical truth, to be in the dynamic relationship of like inner and outer and moving forward, stepping back, and having a lot of joy about about all of what comes with that, the missteps and the mistakes and the wounding that I'm part of, and that I find myself running into, the impulses that arise, and saying, okay, yeah, that too, and let's go on.
Yeah, it's a whole beautiful new way of leadership, right? Very like in complete vulnerability and complete presence to go for complete transformation. It's beautiful. Yeah, so thank you so much, Reverend Angel. We deeply appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us today. And I just want to invite all of us who are here online listening to you, it'll be even beyond the online summit, that people might be watching this talk. So just inviting all of you to check out more about Reverend Angel's work on the two websites. One is Zen Change Angel, exactly how I say it, .com, but also Angel Kyodo Williams.com. So please go and have a look. There's beautiful materials on there. You don't want to miss delving deeper into this body of work. And I'd love to end with a last question. Can you share with our listeners one practice or action that they can implement in their life today to move towards healing personal or collective trauma?
Yeah, I think that the one practice that I would, or that I always encourage people to do, is this moment of being able to come back to the core of your own being. That when you find yourself pulled, a sense of disconnect, a sense of disorientation, that you just drop that. I call it dropping in, right? And allow your weight, the weight of your body, and the center of gravity, the center of attention, so center of gravity and attention, to just drop into your belly and just pause and feel the energy of discomfort that is present for you. Allow yourself to metabolize that discomfort by being with it, and reset. Move forward again, and know that you have that dropping in to the deep truth that each of us carry in our bellies, in our beings. We have all of the instructions that we need. We come out of the womb with them, and they are oftentimes disrupted by the things that happen to us individually and collectively. But we should know that we actually have original instructions of how to be connected, to care for ourselves and each other, and to have compassion. And as long as we deeply remember that is true, and keep coming back to ourselves, it will take us everywhere we need to go. Drop in.
Thank you. So, on behalf of the whole Collective Trauma Online Summit team, I really want to thank you for taking the time. I know you live a very busy life.
Yeah.
Grounded in stillness.
And totally feel like in the fullness of it. Thank you.
Yeah, deeply grounded. Yeah, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us today. And yeah, thank you to everyone also for being here with us, for tuning in, and we invite you to continue listening in. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for doing the work that you're doing, both you all as the folks organizing and holding the summit, and then for the people that are watching. The fact that you are engaged and choosing to watch the summit means that you have exactly the seed that you need to proceed into the world and do the work that is calling you forth. Thank you for being here.